So I stumbled across this video of esports and how it ruined gaming. As an avid fan of gaming and wanting to see it grow in any way possible, I checked out the video and I had a few complaints and questions about it. Now with this, I'm not trying to start up any drama or say who's right or wrong, but there's a few points here that I think needs more clarity. And as a show of good faith, I'll just be showing clips of the video in order instead of the full video itself. This is not to take away any context, but rather for anyone who stumbles across this video to watch the original one, come back and watch this one. So with all that out of the way, let's start.
Imagine this for a second. An arena full of excited fans waiting to watch their favourite video game, but this hyper-competitive, high-octane electronic sport these guys are playing isn't doing too hot right now. It's been dominated by one incredibly powerful strategy, and the game devolves into long and boring matches with no variation. The commentators, passionate and desperate to keep the game alive, are trying to find any breadcrumb of excitement that they can, but they know that it's a futile effort. As the tournament goes on, people start to leave the arena, sponsors lose faith in the game, and eventually, the developer's baby and work of passion has been forced to shut down. This scenario is a game developer's absolute worst nightmare.
If a game is already designed around the esports scene, then yes, it should be the developer's goal to patch out any broken metas, as well as change certain functions so that every season or two relies on something new. I know this is a hypothetical, but even so, a game that's garnered that much support won't go away entirely if it is still fun at its core. The casual audience would continue to play the game and support it for some time, while the more competitive players would either have to make their own rules on their game, like we see in the CDL or Warzone tournaments, or they'll just have to go elsewhere.
Especially in an era where the expectation is that every new multiplayer game release eventually turns into a hyper-competitive esport.
With this point, I would like to know what games you are referring to, because last I checked, Star Wars Battlefront was not taken competitively, nor was Need for Speed or Forza. Valorant was designed specifically for esports, and so was Rainbow Six Siege. I think Apex Legends fits that mold as well to some degree. So what modern multiplayer-based games are made for casuals, but has a strong competitive fan base? This isn't necessarily a bad point, but we kind of need some examples and references, otherwise it's still a hypothetical.
Just because a game comes out with a multiplayer mode in it doesn't mean it has what it takes to be a competitive game. Otherwise we'd be seeing $1 million Mario Kart tournaments crop up everywhere.
Just a quick note, bringing up Mario Kart and how it's not designed for competitive play kind of makes your previous point look bad, as Nintendo doesn't really care to foster an esports environment. So instead of devs making games that are heavy towards esports, you showed a game where they don't care about it at all.
So what sets Mario Kart apart from, say, League of Legends or Street Fighter? And what makes a good esport? Well, to answer that question, I'll go through the reasons people seem to think are true, but really aren't. There's a common notion that rampant dev support is needed for a game to be successful in a tournament setting. That without millions of dollars from the developers and Coca-Cola sponsorships at every event, then your game is just going to die. Games like Fortnite had to learn this the hard way, because although the Fortnite World Cup had the biggest prize pool in esports history and a massive arena full of rabid children, it still couldn't escape the fact that the game itself doesn't make for a good viewing experience, because all you see is a battle of who gets the luckiest with their weapon drops and which player can build a tower the fastest instead of actually shooting the other guy. All you have to do to disprove this is look at the numerous examples where games have had large and passionate communities with little to no dev support, such as the Smash community and pretty much the entire early FGC.
This is true for the most part. I don't have any real issue with this section other than the Fortnite example. It's not the dev's fault that the game became competitive, and while a battle royale can be difficult to show an audience what's going on, it doesn't subtract the skills required to be a good player. Speed building is a skill. If anything, it shows why the game is competitive. Now, I don't play Fortnite, and I don't intend to unless they make a first-person no-build mode, but I can still appreciate the kind of skills required to be a good player in that game.
These games were, or still are, alive and kicking, with only the passion of a few players and grassroots crowdfunding efforts to keep tournaments running. The devs wouldn't have done much to grow the FGC in the first place if it hadn't had that backbone of passionate grassroots support from the 90s and 2000s. It doesn't matter how many skins and characters Multiverses adds, it's not going to fix the server connectivity issues and the lack of modes other than online versus. And you can see the results of that in its dramatic drop in players since release. If you want a modern game for an example, take CSGO, a game that has had periods of years go by with little to no significant additions to content, at least until Valorant came out. and it is still one of the biggest and most beloved esports of all time. Having too little content makes a game feel shallow and unfinished, sure, but adding too much content can make a game feel bloated or even negatively impact the game experience if the new map or weapon favours a degenerate strategy. And I know what you're thinking, Ardrid, if there's something degen in a game, they should just nerf it. And I fully agree, but let's focus on that point a little more. Because all of these big company sponsorships and content altering patches pale in comparison to the most important thing that everyone says a good esport must have: the elusive and ever desired concept of balance. It's the idea that as many options in the game should be viable at the highest levels of play, and through that the metagame will be healthy and intriguing for the players and a fascinating experience to watch for the viewers at home. Balancing a game is always tough, and there's a ton of different philosophies you can use to accomplish it. Okay, at this point some of you might be thinking something like, this guy is such a dumbass. He's making it seem like none of these things matter with anecdotal examples of games that came out 20 years ago that didn't have any of those things. These games didn't have the same standards or lofty expectations that we have now, nor do they have the same level of options that we do now.
Yes, this is true. Well, sort of. We all know games back then would typically not be patched or rebalanced, other than the myriad of sequels and remixes that would be developed. And while yes, I would advocate competitive games to have some sort of balance, I know not everything will be balanced, and that balance will have to change from season to season. And if someone is trying to be an esports pro, they kind of have to pick a game. So while there can be options, it may not be in the best interest of a pro player to jump ship. Note, I said pro player, not content creator or retired pro.
Players at the time probably just stuck with their game despite being unbalanced or bloated or whatever, right? Wrong.
I think this is just bad wording, because when Ardrid says stuck with your games, it means there's a lack of transition. But the example you show is them not transitioning and going back to a previous game. I understand the straw man argument of they kept going on to the new game instead of sticking with the old, but using the word stick to equal transition is kind of weird. So yes, people did stick with their old games instead of always transitioning to the new one.
Well, to answer that question, I think it's finally time to get into the actual things that I think create a great and successful esport. 1. The game needs to be easy to understand and watch. It doesn't necessarily have to be fast paced, but what it does have to be is something that even someone who has never even seen the game before can look at and understand just from a glance. The game's objectives, important elements such as health and damage, and even strategies need to be as easy to understand as possible. As an easy to understand game is going to have a much simpler time bringing in new players than a visual clusterfuck like Fortnite's pro scene. Overwatch has consistently run into this problem with its esports circuit too, where there are just so many particle effects and stuff happening on screen with no downtime whatsoever that it's overwhelming for people who don't understand the game inside and out.
Another esport that I think is difficult to watch is Rainbow Six Siege. But it's still a very popular esport and will take time to understand what's going on. There will always be a learning curve when playing or watching a game, so complexity is not a bad thing overall. It's up to the announcers to help decode the chaos and make it easier to understand. And maybe with some better directing, the game can be easier to understand. As you stated before and will state later, it's the community that makes the esport, not necessarily the large million-dollar tournaments or high viewer count.
2. A competent and passionate community and tournament organisers. I'm not talking about some random bog standard event organiser. I'm talking about someone from the community of their game that's passionate and hardworking. Usually someone who was a die-hard player themselves who transitioned into TOing. If your game's competitive scene can't at some point sustain itself on passion alone, then it has little hope of succeeding in a wider context. And 3, this one is the most important one. The game's mechanics need to be as perfectly balanced as possible. Some of you are going to say that I'm contradicting myself here, as I literally just said that balance wasn't important, but let's make a key distinction here. All of the examples I showed of unbalanced games gaining esports success were unbalanced in their rosters, their weapons, their specific elements in which you interact with the game mechanics.
I may have a few nitpicks here or there, but I agree overall with this point. If the base game doesn't allow for any sort of competitive play, it probably would be left alone by competitive players. But the game itself may still have a large fanbase.
I don't think that esports itself has ruined gaming. Far from it. I love esports myself, but the mentality and glorification of esports that it puts the community and devs into definitely has. It isn't because ranked has caused tryhards to pop up everywhere and I can't 360 no-scope noobs anymore like back in the good old Modern Warfare 2 days, but because game devs all over the world look at the prestige and deep competitive history of games like League of Legends and Street Fighter, and they lust for it so hard that they fail to see the mountain that they had to climb to reach that peak.
Overall, this video is good and I do enjoy this discussion. When it comes to this final point though of game devs trying to make the next esport, I would like some examples. I can think of Battlefield 2042, Multiverse, and maybe Knockout City. But I would like to know what games Ardred is thinking about. In my own opinion, I do want to play online games that have some balanced game modes. I'm fine if there's an all-out game mode where everyone can use anything, but I would also like to have the option of turning that off. It all depends on what the developers are trying to accomplish. At the same time, when a new game begins to have a growing competitive community, I would like to see the devs create an environment for that to flourish. Instead of having to rely on the community to be self-reliant and having to make their own rules, their own mods, and tournaments, but we see time and time again that more devs are willing to ignore them. Overwatch being in a constant state of broken because some heroes are abused in high-ranked play, Rainbow Six Siege having certain gameplay elements that pro players hate, and having to wait months if not years to see any kind of progress, if at all. Overall, if a game grows a competitive scene, it can live or die by the next patch, the competitive scene that is, but not necessarily the game. At that point, what do we blame? Do we blame the competitive nature and that the desire for an esport has ruined gaming? Or do we blame the developers for ignoring their community? And on that bombshell, I am Mr. Rain, and I will see you next time.